Today, our presenter is Richard Wagner. I don't think he needs a long introduction here. Of course, the organization has been inspired by Dick's work, so we are all familiar with him and with his many accomplishments and publications. So I will just focus on three things, maybe four things that changed since Dick presented for us 2 years ago at our inaugural lecture. So the first thing is that, as he just said, he's now a Professor Emeritus from George Mason University, so no longer teaching at George Mason, but that doesn't stop his amazing publication record. He has 2 books just this year with Rethinking Public Choice and Rethinking Economics as Social Theory. So I highly recommend you check those publications out. I will throw the links in into the chat box as we start the lecture. And I guess on top of those 2 books, I just checked an SSRN for recent publications, and since that 2020 lecture, Dick has added 12 papers there. So an amazing productivity and an example for us all. Yeah, I don't think you need more of an introduction, Dick. Everyone's greatly familiar with your work. So I think just with that, the screen is yours, and then we will join you with questions after the presentation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Let me get my phone going, because you told me 25 minutes, and so there will be a public alarm if I go over and you all will hear, and I will embarrass myself. But on this particular topic, as I think I put in a footnote in the paper, this is written for a Liberty Fund conference that's coming up next week, or next month, I should say, in about a month from now. Systems-theoretic LawMacro, an antidote to Keynesian indigestion is the title I've been working with, though I might need to tweak the title to get a journal to accept it sometime. You never know about these things. And I also see that somehow my screen size has changed. Well, I don't know how to master these things. I just have to, just have to take it as it is. Anyway, the point of this paper stems from a very strong kind of feeling that social life in general in this country and in much of the West is, I think, going in direction opposite to what I think it would be desirable to see it go. And my questions concern trying to understand how that comes about. And I, at the same time, have a strong feeling that there is an awful lot of superficiality that invades modern economics and social science. Superficiality in the sense of being content with connecting dots between contemporary observations, when much of the real action and causation is taking place beneath the surface, which goes back, of course, to the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment and the recognition that the things behind the scenes are of very deep importance, and that because of that, I've tied this to the idea of a law in macroeconomics, which is a growing industry, you might say, that's starting to take shape, where traditional law in economics has very much been generally a pro-market kind of enterprise, because after all, what law and economics has fundamentally concerned are the kinds of transactions and relationships that generate the economic orders that we observe. Where we need law macro, there's no such thing as transactions to speak of in macroeconomics. It's all planning and imposition and things like that. And so I have tackled this law macro, feeling that that would be horrible to have a law and macroeconomics contending with traditional law and economics, if it's going to be what now passes for macroeconomics as being what is the mode of thinking. And so that puts me in the position of asking myself, well, what would a macroeconomics look like that was centered on people making transactions and the making of those transactions generating what we recognize as the social configurations inside of which we are all embedded. And so that's what I want to proceed. And how am I to go about doing that? Somehow I hit upon that old statement from Ludwig Feuerbach that man is what he eats would be the statement. And of course, Feuerbach was a well-known materialist, not a Marxist, but a materialist all the same. And as I thought about it, I realized that almost all economists for the last century or so have been philosophical materialists. And I'm not. And I pose then the question, well, if you operated from the point of view of a philosophical idealist, that among the main philosophers of my own personal interest over the last century, you'd find such people as Henri Bergson, Robin Collingwood, Arthur Lovejoy, all very much idealist philosophers. Or what you would have then is, if you were to take Feuerbach, you would say something like, man is what he thinks. And that in turn would bring into the foreground things like thoughts, plans, hopes, aspirations, not the stuff of allocation distribution theory directly. Those things would be secondary to, because they would emerge out of or stem from these other things. And in that respect, when you get to knowledge, my own favorite with respect to economics and knowledge goes back to my encounter with Frank Knight in 1963. It wasn't a direct encounter. I went to graduate school there in Virginia, and Knight was still in Chicago. He did come to Virginia to visit. But Knight, again and again in his various works, would say that what's really going to hurt us is not what we don't know. That doesn't hurt. It's what we know that is not true. And I think that turns the whole problem of knowledge around in a significant way. And I think it gives us opportunities to move forward in a different way or in a different direction. And so if it's what we don't know, if it's what we know that's not true, I think we could easily go through modern contemporary life and find all kinds of examples of that. my own my own sort of sense of that would be well, I suppose I should start with, and this paper I realize is too long for 25 pages, but I'm trying on the fly to figure out how I want to cut back a bit on this. But it's what I want to, I'm doing in this paper, and is trying to go forward from that book of 2 years ago, where I set forth some elements of a systems theory approach to macroeconomics. And now what I'm trying to do is dig more deeply into some of the transactional kinds of issues that come about. Now, you have to start with Keynes, I guess, in any kind of macro theory. But if you think about if man is what he thinks rather than what he eats, that is going to put the fundamental burden and opportunity upon the way that we go about explaining what we're thinking about. Because if you look at standard Keynesian style macro, and I think we're all aware of Axel Leonhofen and his Keynesian economics and the economics of Keynes, where he denied that Keynes really conformed to the C plus I plus G notion. All that stuff is in there, of course, but and Keynes published an article a year after the book came out that was very much in the subjectivist mode. But still, even if Keynes wasn't a C plus I plus G fellow, he added that in there too. I mean, Keynes was a slippery sort of fellow that would, who was always claimed to be able to convince anyone to think his way if given the chance. So if you look at macro theory, either of the immediate post-war period as it was dominated by C plus I plus G, or by the more recent DSGE style of modeling, what you have is a scheme of thought where any shortfall in private spending can be offset by increased public spending. And in that case, if you think behind the scenes, though, what you've had taking place is a presupposition that the only source of remedy for things going astray is government spending. Because in that model of whether DSGE or the old C plus I plus G, private spending is a piece of data. And if you're unhappy with the data, the only place that situation can be remedied is by public action. Well, that's a silly thing to, I think, run with, but it's in the model. There is no alternative within that model because private spending is just data. And the place where there's, and data in that sense is passive, the place where you find activity, then in that model is government. And so it's necessary to think back away from all of the antics of aggregationist economics, because the way those aggregations proceed to be shaped and the work they do is in these exercises about thinking. The only place where a bad situation can be made better is through the deployment of governmental power. It's as pure and simple as that. And sure, there are some macro theorists who don't like the idea of governmental power and imposition any better than I do, but they in turn work with a presumption of a system in equilibrium, which in turn makes it meaningful to aggregate transactions away, because all transactions in society are assumed to occur at the same moment in historical time. And so to get out of that box, that collectivist box you set yourself inside of, I think there are some things you have to do differently, some elements of thinking you have to do differently, starting from the presumption that what's really important and significant to humans are their ideas, hopes, dreams, aspirations, plans, projections, all of these things. And it's those things out of which things like resource allocations, distributions of income and wealth and all that emerge as secondary features. Now, in turn, of course, politicians are a special breed. They're not like the rest of us. That's almost the contrary of this very standard public choice that politicians are just like everybody else. Well, in some sense, yes, they are, but in a very important sense, no, they aren't. And it's here where I have become, over the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, a real, especially strong fan of Italian from the late 19th, early 20th century. Well, I become fans of many Italians from that period of time, actually. But the one I'm thinking about right now is Mafio Pantaleone. And he published a two-part piece in 1911 titled something like Properties of a System of Political Pricing. Now, I think one of the things I think I noted about Pantaleone in the paper actually is that he actually had a form of an impossibility of socialist calculation 9 years before Mises published his. Pantaleone asked us to think of a society that operated through two bazaars. One was a bazaar where all the shops offered their goods at market prices. Now, market prices in Pantaleone's time was a very objectivist price equals marginal cost kind of notion. So it was technical conditions of production that generated market prices. And then you could, of course, spin a theory of economic organization on that grounds, which of course was exactly what was taking place in the world of economic theory in that time. But then Pantaleone is one of several Italian economists wanted to move away from thinking of government as an agency that had to be instructed by economists. Those Italian fellows recognized, Pantaleone, Davidi, so forth and so on, that politicians knew how to be politicians. They knew better about that. Forgot to turn this off. I don't know how to turn it off. Politicians recognized how to be politicians. And instead, what Pantaleone, Davidi, and so forth and so on wanted to do was ask, what is the real economic logic that governs the actions of political enterprises, the sizes of political enterprises, and so forth? So turn where the standard theory of public finance throughout the history of economics has been one of instructing somebody, not really politicians, but instructing some general citizen what would be the public good. These Italian thinkers pursued the question of political persons know how to be politicians, and there's a rhyme and reason to such things as the sizes of governmental entities and the pattern of activities among governmental activities, and the formal principles in play are the same as are in play with reference to ordinary market activities. So then the shops in the political bazaar are organized within a system of political prices. Now, how would you theorize about political prices? That's a significant question. Market prices at the time were theorized in terms of technical conditions of production. Pantaleone recognized that that wasn't the way you could theorize about political prices. And instead, political enterprises, in a technical sense, exist parasitically on market enterprises, in that the way in which political enterprises are financed is through making tax impositions on market transactions. That is, it's the market transactions that provide the means to support political enterprises. Political enterprises aren't financed directly by payments received from people who want the things political enterprises provide. They're financed by taxes extracted on market transactions in one sense or another. If you think about the range of taxes that are used to finance public activities, they're all based on market transactions, whether it be excise taxes as taxes directly on particular items of consumption, income taxes as taxes on some aggregate of earnings over some interval of time. And So in this respect, what you find out is that there are very much limits. You cannot have a regime of totally political pricing for the same reasons as Mises thought you couldn't, but he explained it differently, because rather than talking about claims of various goodnesses, public good, private good, and so forth, here the talk was more in terms of the world of actual affairs and how people get their bread, their cheese, their eggs, their parts, and so on and so forth. And that there has to be an institutionally based rhyme and reason for the way the entire world works, and with some features in that world perhaps being not so generally desirable as other features are. And rather than getting wrapped up in dialogue saying we should have less public, more private, and so forth, the basic idea from Pantaleone and company was a thinking that, well, if you lay it out how it works, you might get less of it. Although, oh my goodness. Well, that's that. Take about 3 more minutes and I'll be done. I'm not sure just the ability to explain how the system actually works we can support for relative to what it does now, where that support is very much wrapped in mythological, I would say, languages of public goods, redistributive justice, and all those things, which all, I think, have references that are pretty much meaningless. But indeed, one of the main Italian practicing political economists was Antonio de Marco, who, besides being a professor of public finance in Rome for about 50 years, also served about 20 years as a member of the Italian parliament. He was elected from his hometown out in Lecce in the far south. And he had written an interesting book. It was actually a collection of essays titled something like My 20 Years of, or 30 Years of Political Struggle. And these were a series of essays he published about the venality and the rent-seekingness and all that went on in the Italian parliament. And but one thing I want to stop, then I'll stop, is in all of this trying to move economics into a more transactional, less aggregative, more complexity-friendly mode of analysis. I thought, I closed this paper by taking a simple example we all take. And I thought about putting that example in because earlier in the paper I had compared how Paul Samuelson, with his 1948 Principles book, had totally corrupted the structure of economic theory very successfully by removing what had been the more or less Marshallian standard theory or organization of economic theory, where there was only economics, and where Samuelson had equal weight to micro and macro, and how in 1964, Armin Alchian and William Allen came up with their university economics, which reverted to the structure of economics prior to Keynes, prior to Samuelson, and how that didn't get an audience. That was, I taught from it, but it didn't get an audience, which in a way shows how thoroughly, as Mark Blaud noted, Keynes had transformed economics within a 10-year period, and it's been that way ever since. And in this paper, and as well as that book from 2 years ago, I'm simply looking around, trying to, because I think, since it is all ideas anyway, thinking that if there is going to be a way of dislodging this pro-collective, monolithic state notion, it's going to be in the realm of ideas, and ideas of a sort that make concepts like emergence more central. And I use this example because Alchian and Allen used it throughout their book too, of trade, of the standard model of an Edgeworth box. Now, with an Edgeworth box is an aggregate piece of theory. It aggregates two traders, and the theorist has information about what the two traders want and shows a range where they can each increase their well-being relative to where they start from. But that tells you about the end result of exchange, but it doesn't tell you anything about how you get there, how that comes about. It doesn't tell you anything about the importance of private ordering in all of this. Modern macroeconomics, DSGE, and all that stuff is fundamentally developed around a world of public ordering. At least public order, whereas where all the action is, rather than private ordering. And so I, in that little concluding page or two, ask, well, in terms of a world where people are continually pursuing their interests, their thoughts, putting together plans and enterprises, this it's not an Edgeworth box prefabricated universe that you want to work with, but one where, so it's not the realm of the state to see that things work well, because everybody within the society has the ability to contribute to that. The example I gave was this one landowner who offered to extend a drainage canal to the adjacent property owner. And you could imagine what kinds of business commercial activities would emerge out of that. But it's that whole motif where change is an internal generation among the participants in a system. And whereas our current standards of thinking so overwhelmingly move in a collectivist, politically oriented direction. And I certainly don't think that the way a real business cycle modeling and so forth is at all going to lead to any kind of salutary change. And I think Abigail and I put out a paper a couple of years ago on an open-ended evolutionary alternative to the DSGE modeling, and I plan to do a whole lot more of that over the next several years. And this paper is just one more instance, and it's written in a sense of not that I have discovered how to do that. I don't think cutting down the Keynesian tree is not a job for one person, but I wanted to lay out what I think are some of the obstacles that are holding us back. Those obstacles, I think being buying into the over presumption that we are fundamentally humans, meaning fundamentally materialist creatures consumed with our wealth and our distributional spectrum, as against being more idealist creatures concerned with our hopes, aspirations, plans, enterprises, children, and all this sort of thing. And with that, I'm going to stop and look forward to hearing what insights you all might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, excellent. So I will start us off maybe with a question, or sort of my understanding of this project as an exercise in the Republic of Science, right? So you recognize a set of ideas that are not useful. It's an indigestion, right? Keynesian indigestion, and you propose a better direction. And yet at the same time in the paper, you recognize that Keynes's adoption of his ideas wasn't necessarily, it was politically expedient, right? Like one of the things that contributed to the success of that mode of thinking was its political expediency. So I guess my question is, can we succeed by just having better ideas, right? Is that like, so, because elsewhere you've been critical of the sort of Republic of Science. So with that, like who's the customer here, right? Like, are we trying to persuade current macroeconomists to take on a different path, or advanced popular understanding, sort of in like Erwin's way of economist as an emancipator? So anyway, I'll let you comment on that.
No, I'm certainly not hostile to the Republic of Science, but I think like any process like this, scientific competition can certainly be salutary. It's absolutely necessary. But there are also various ways in which scientific competition can proceed. For instance, in his 1966, I think it was, Organization of Inquiry, Gordon Tullock worked with a notion of open competition among scientists for support, starting, and out of that free and open competition, people would do such things as develop chains of communication, establishing journals, professional associations. And as those things proceed, you also find that such social phenomena as standing, status, journal editorships become coveted. And as it grows, there becomes the question perhaps of funding. In Tullock's original, I think, formulations, people funded their own science, much as Tullock, throughout all the time I knew him from my graduate student days, did things like keep ants in his house in cages, of course, glass cages, and he liked to do that. And but then when you get to things like big, gigantic corporations, governmental agencies, and so forth, where you move from a regime where people are on one level are thinking for themselves, and are autonomous creatures, perhaps in that thinking. And then you could imagine that to what extent scientific-like output is purchased, whether it be by governmental or corporate kinds of organizations. I think the world it's a messier type of world, but I certainly still like the Republic of Science, and I consider myself as very much a partisan of it. But at the same time, I recognize that all of these things are contentious. And that that's very much a deep-rooted part of human nature. I mean, we all want to get along with one another, but we also want to do well. And some people more concerned about things like standing and so forth than other people, but we are a complex, raucous creature. And I think that's just how it is. I mean,
Okay, so let's see if there are other questions. If you could just raise your hand and jump in with your questions. Okay, so I see Abigail. Let's go to you, Abigail, and then I have Cameron and Stefan. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize in advance for my internet connection. I'm in Spain on mobile data, so we'll see how this works. Thanks very much for this. I loved reading it, and I will love even talking about it even more in Florida. So I was struck particularly by the Knight quote. I might steal that for another paper, so I will attribute you. That man is what not man is. Let's see, what's really going to hurt is not what we what we don't know, but what we know that isn't true. So it's this idea that we have this way of comprehending our world or our system that is always not completely correct. It's always wrong in some way. And that we're constantly not just getting information as if we're machines and have perfect processing centers and can determine what is true and not, but we are updating our theory of the world as we go along. And so our epistemology itself is almost static in that it is based on a sort of closed system. And this is I see Roger nodding his head because he and I are working on this right now. And we've been thinking a lot about this. And epistemology itself, I mean, Dick, I turned to this in working on our games theory paper. As I was working out the plans, then I realized we needed an epistemology because for the other folks, this is the systems theoretic way, one of the candidate systems theoretic ways of looking at interaction for some kind of emergent behavior, hopefully. And the idea that game theory is two extreme idealizations of what is a much larger theory of interaction. Basically, one of the idealizations of game theory is everyone plays the same game, everyone knows what's going on in the game. And those are just two extreme ideal cases, kind of like the perfect pendulum in physics. It's used everywhere, but it's not actually anywhere in physics. There's no real perfect pendulum out there, right? It's used everywhere. But everything that we know and experience is in between, and we don't really have a good theory of what's going on there because it becomes very complex very quickly. But we have tools and methods to think about this complexity now. And we do so imperfectly because we do everything imperfectly. The map is never the territory, but we have a place to start. And so the way I see systems theory progressing is with some of these tools that we have and these ways of looking at things and these new ideas to plunder. And we also have this other sense of this open-ended evolutionary unknowability, which I think is the other side of the systems theoretic coin, and might need some more epistemological treatment. But those there's two huge frontiers that we can work in, and we can use methods in, and we can do things with. And there's, and Warren Weaver, I love your bringing up Weaver, because Weaver pointed out that economic theory is all about organized complexity, and that is the very thing that we don't study. And we still don't study it, not really. But so the frontier, it's wonderful to be a theorist right now. We are very lucky, all of us together, very lucky. There's a huge frontier to explore, and this is what reading this paper was all about. That macroeconomics, boy, what a frontier. Because nothing's really been done yet. I mean, one agent copied many times in a loud voice is not a system. So I appreciate very much what you've done. I don't have a question. I just have praise and hope and enthusiasm. And thank you very much.
No, but speaking of hope, though, some of you may have heard me in this in classes from days and times past, but I have for a long time held and mentioned in classes that the macroeconomics is almost hopeless. And it's without a doubt, the totally worst part of economics. Microeconomics is okay, not great, but it's okay. But it's macro, because that's where you get the entire system of social relations and interactions and so forth. And so I undertook that book from 2 years ago and this paper now, and project much of my work over the next 5-10 years or whatever it is, as getting into this more, what is it, how do we live in, how do the human animal live inside of the systems, when I think part of our natures are, as the Scots recognized, that sure, we can be friendly people, helpful people, putting together deals and organizations and so forth. So we can do that very well. But we also can be, some of us more than others. That's another problem, I think, with much economics, is a presumption of a uniformity among the species. We're all fundamentally clones of one another, or close to it, when in fact, you can find some people are apparently seen to be relatively calm, peaceful people. Other people are easy at raining terror on yet other people, and so forth. I mean, we are. And so this challenge of trying to, it's not just we live in a civilized order or civil order, but it's a project that continually has to be in process and underway, and that's a contentious process. I mean, that's the other side of things, is that we are a creature that to live well together is going to require overcoming various kinds of points of contention and so forth and so on. And it's, that's just how it is.
All righty. I think we have Cameron next. Cameron.
Hi. So you, in your paper, you noted that that substantive conclusions follow theoretical form, which is surely true to some extent. But you set up kind of a dichotomy, or you set an antinomy between an aggregative approach and a transactional approach. And I'm wondering to what extent you think there's room to reconcile these. For example, in my unit on GDP, in my intro macro class, I tell my students, what does GDP mean? It's an aggregate of the value that got created, or the wants and needs, the value of the wants and needs that were satisfied in a particular year in a particular place. Now, when does it mean this? It means this when the thing that we are aggregating is market prices. And so strictly speaking, a GDP aggregate over non-market prices is going to be completely meaningless. And so I tell them the story about Paul Samuelson's famous graph where he says that Soviet GDP is going to overtake US GDP in 10 years or whatever. Why did he get this so wrong? Because GDP was just not a meaningful number if you're not sensitive to the process that generated it. And so I like to think that these two approaches are not necessarily opposed, but do you think that's a legitimate reconciliation, or would you still advise in your ideal theoretical world just ditching the idea of a GDP aggregate entirely?
I don't know that I'd want to ditch the idea of an aggregate. There might be some useful purpose it might serve. I don't think it would be, in my judgment, I don't know, it would be of any great primary purpose. I don't use GDP measures in determining where I want to go to when I'm traveling to various places and things like that. I think that the course of the last century and a half or so, somewhere in there, has been a movement in a increasingly collectivist, public ordered kind of direction. And I think there's a lot of things that have fit together. It's not just one thing, but I think a lot of things have fit together, starting with the materialism, then I think the GDP has and growth theory has kind of led to a focus on aggregate stuff, measures, as against such things, more subjective things about what you might call the entrepreneurial interest, the entrepreneurial spirit. Apparently, from a number of things I said, seeing that there's apparently, by some surveys, less and less interest in people going into business, forming their own businesses and so forth, at least in this country. And at the same time, it's also the fact that such things as governmental agencies like Internal Revenue Services and so forth give extra effort at auditing small businesses, although they have corporate audit staffs too. But if you suppose you're asked the question, what would the size of government in the aggregate be if we lived in a world described as a nation of shopkeepers? It would be much smaller, because who collects taxes? Who imposes regulations? Really, it's big corporations. They do all the record keeping to impose taxes. They aid the imposing of regulations and policing of regulations. I mean, so the relation between businesses and governments is itself is a very complex kind of thing that I don't see the point of trying to talk about some general universal government business relationship as against a lot of different kinds of instances of relationship.
All righty, and now Stefan. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Dick. Good to see everybody. Dick, I have the greatest sympathy for this notion of idealist economics, as you called it, and I think it's difficult to be a subjectivist if you're not an idealist. But then my question is this. So the other day I was talking to an assistant professor here at Princeton who actually has attended Mario's colloquium for quite a few semesters, so he knows about our debates. And then he asked me, why did Keynes win specifically in capturing the bright minds in England in the 30s as opposed to Hayek. And my answer was that Hayek didn't have any hope to offer in his apparatus of idealist, micro-founded, etc., economics of the time. And so it was difficult to remain an individualist and Hayekian in that time of hopelessness. And so people went to Keynes, and Keynes sold them the hope of control. Now, what the kids made past Samuelson is, of course, what we know. So what do you think should be, in your view, the hope which we have to sell so that people get attracted to that type of economics? Is it some rhetoric, some metaphor? And especially people who don't just buy into that thinking in processes and open-ended complexity, which all of us here in the room tend to like, but somebody outside. So what would be the capture, the bait, which you would offer such a person to get hopeful and get off the control train?
First of all, I accept the response that Keynes offered hope. And it, you could, it's always possible to say that preceding inflation in the 1920s led to increasing disorganization in the 1930s that brought about collapse. I think that's a correct answer to it. But it may mean, and I'm not going to offer what it does or doesn't mean, it's beyond me, but it may mean that we are too much a grip of what you might call almost utopian-esque thinking, governed by or guided by notions of free and open competition, long-run equilibrium, and so forth. And that human societies are invariably going to be experiencing better times, worse times, and as a result, those better and worse times, there's going to appear in all societies, pundits offering their various remedies. That's also part of the human condition. I mean, the human condition is, if we go back to that Knight point I opened with, which Roger also posted, I saw a note there that mentioned Josh Billings as the person to whom Knight always attributed this, but I'm well familiar with Knight. I've actually never looked further into Josh Billings, but I know he was an American humorist of the 19th century. And that it's, is there a problem we as humans and the schemes of social living we generate among ourselves are far removed from anyone's idea of utopianism, and yet we so often embrace utopian-esque ideas, perfectionist ideas, and so on and so forth. Knight, for instance, let me just say one thing about Knight, again, some on that topic. In his Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, he had, of course, two big parts. The first big part, which was part two, was his theory of perfect competition. And then the second was the theory of imperfect competition. And what strikes me as really noticeable about that is those terms are alive today still, but totally contrary to how Knight used them. That there's the idea that perfect competition is nice, but unattainable. And imperfect competition means there's room to improve. Where do you find room to improve? Well, within most theories, it has to be governmental agencies that do the improving. Where Knight was just the opposite. There was no perfect competition, was not any kind of attainable state of affairs. It was a response to the question, what would it be like if a society were to exist where everyone got their just desserts? That's what the theory of competition meant for Knight. And Knight recognized, well, such a thing doesn't exist because the world is always imperfect in all kinds of margins. And yet the very existence then of many margins of imperfection simply means there exists many margins of profit opportunities from reorganization, new businesses, and so on and so forth indefinitely. And in Knight's view of the world, then it was the continual competitive, open competitive process that was always going to be chipping away at margins of injustice that were apparent throughout the land. And that's just a very different scheme of thought. Knight, of course, was a philosophical idealist too. And so anyway, I still see there's more questions, so I'll stop.
Okay, I see Roger, Nathaniel, and I'm gonna put myself back in the line. I don't know if I can raise a hand. It doesn't allow me, but anyway, Roger, the floor is yours, and Nathaniel, and then if time allows, I will jump in.
Yeah, I'll just try to, I just think, one of the themes here is like, why sort of, us, whatever us means, sort of struggling so much to get across some of these ideas. And I think part of the problem is what rational means to people. Rational is something like, the God's eye view. Rational minds are all alike. I mean, think of rational expectations, or like Almond's agree to disagree, his agreement theorem. And rationality makes many minds, so-called rationality, makes many minds into one mind, and that one mind has the God's eye view. And so, what's kind of the opposite of that is at the same, two different things that you wouldn't maybe think belong in the same box, but I think Abby will agree that with me when I say I think they do belong in the same box, and that's the sort of Turing-Gödel stuff and Bergson, right? And yeah, getting a nod. So I mean, okay, so that's kind of where I feel like we can sort of go and stuff. And I really like Gödel because it's, it's hard, it's math, but it points against the God's eye view. But it's really an uphill slog, because it seems like if you want to be rational, you have to have the God's eye view. Reason, being rational, is about arranging the pieces like Smith's man of system. So it's a great challenge. It's a deep challenge. All we can do is struggle. I guess that's a comment, not a question, but there it is.
Yeah, sometimes I wish I could abolish rationality as a concept and just go with, we are endowed with the capacity of reason. We know what it means to be reasonable, unreasonable. Rationality is, I think it is a God's eye kind of view that it's been. I remember one time speaking of rationality, it was Gordon Tullock, and it was rationality, and someone had, I don't know whether it was a kind of a prisoner's dilemma model that Tullock was quizzing the presenter about, or what it is, but the presenter was saying that in a model of too much force, you just had to submit. And Tullock said, sometimes you just get pissed off and want to fight back. And, that's all part of us, inside of us too. And does that, and so should that person who fought back be described and labeled as being irrational, nonsensical, and so forth? No, you could, anything that seems to be irrational, you can always turn it around and say, well, he just had a strong negative disutility to being around this other bloke. And so I don't know what rationality really gives us, actually, except for answers to well-posed problems. And it's just like, well, all that undecidability kind of stuff and computational combinatorial complexity, where it would take forever to enumerate all of the options. So you can't even calculate expected values. But if you wait to try to calculate, you're going to die before you finish calculating. You haven't lived. So after a certain point, you have to get on and go. And that gets us into these questions of timology, timos, and all that sort of stuff, or the spiritedness that exists. Yeah, I'm all for that.
Sad. All righty. Let me see here. I guess we had the. Sorry, I'm not. Yeah, Natalia, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you for this paper. That was very interesting. I have three things maybe, but in order of importance, you bring up the importance of personal responsibility and liability as being associated with legal principles of a liberal order. I hadn't really thought about that. I usually talk about protection of property rights and enforcement of contracts, which are obvious to me, but adding this bit about personal responsibility and liability, somehow I've neglected it, and I'm wondering, where are we picking that up from? I know, Buchanan was very concerned with paternalism, especially in his later writings. I'm wondering if it's in the Oiken or someplace else where that's well articulated. Second thing is that you talk about two cores of democratic governance in your paper. And the first, you have one that's factionalism. It seems like you drop any discussion of factionalism through the rest of the paper. I wanted to know if you could say more about how factionalism influences this entanglement. And then there's this final thought that I mentioned earlier. Hayek postulated turbulence that was generally limited and less than Schumpeter's creative destruction. I'm wondering if Hayek had allowed for a greater amount of turbulence in his development of his capital theory, he might have avoided writing himself into a corner on that. But we see him explicitly limiting his openness to problems of turbulence in his 1945 paper, Use of Knowledge in Society, in direct response to Schumpeter, where he sort of excuses away the problem of large-scale turbulence.
Okay, let me, on the responsibility, liability, that one of your questions, that of course was, where I first came across it was back when I was a graduate student practicing for my German exam. Back there when I was a graduate student in ancient times, you had to pass exams in German and French. And then later on, after I told Buchanan how happy I was when I passed the second exam I took, which is the French one, he said, now you should work on Italian, which I didn't do for about 10 years. And then I did that too. But anyway, it was Walter Oiken's Grundsatz that he talked about the principles of an economic order as revolving around the principles of property, contract, and liability, which corresponds to the basic common law scheme of property, contract, and tort as the ingredients that if you find a society where people correspond to those legal principles, which in turn reflect certain ethical norms, you will find that the patterns of social organization that emerge or interaction that emerge have the features of a market economy. Now, the 2 versus 3 that you asked about, actually, Marta and I wrote a paper on this. I think this was in Review of Austrian Economics. 2015, maybe 2016, 17. Well, it doesn't. I know your memory is better than mine, but anyway.
I think it's the Review of Political Economy 2017. Is that?
I don't. I'd have to get my beat out and look over it, but I don't want to do that either. But the basic idea there is that everything about a market economy you can illustrate with a 2-person example. This is also a theme of Richard Epstein's Simple Rules for a Complex World. Where he opened that book by noting how so many people say in a complicated world we need more and more government. But Epstein made the simple point that no, you don't, because the most incredibly complex worldwide enterprise can be put together through the simple principles of property, contract, and liability, common law principles, and that 2 is the magic number for the most complex sorts of transactions can be put together, where the most complex transactions are going to feature parties on 2 sides coming together, hammering out margins of agreement until they can run with it. Whereas when you get to things political, then Marta and I talked about that the magic number is 3, because you have 2 people who fabricate an agreement, and then a 3rd person who is brought in unwillingly into the agreement to bear a good part of the cost of that agreement. And so those are our magic numbers, and the 3 then being a form of factionalism. And then turbulence. I asked about turbulence thirdly. Turbulence is always there. I think, again, I think this idea of long run equilibrium and so forth gives a very kind of false notion of what it's like to live in society. It's a vision of society that must be appeal only to some kind of imagined director of society who wants to see that everybody is in their place. But that's why way back in 1997, I put out that article where I made that first distinction or comparison between a parade and a crowd of spectators leaving an arena, and that there are uses for models of parades. If you're a parade marshal, you need to think in terms of equilibrium terms where your units are in order and your members are marching in step. But otherwise, if you're trying to think about the old Scottish Enlightenment question of how does a society really hang together? What is it? What you're theorizing about there, or need to be theorizing about there, is what you might call an iceberg. You realize, 90% of an iceberg lies beneath the surface. You can't see it. And that's where the action is. And if you get into the Scottish folks, that's what they were getting at in trying to understand the features that hold together society, and much of it is below the surface, but vital. But in that kind of model, there's always going to be turbulence. But within a world of private ordering, people own their parts of the turbulence. If you have an enterprise that's not doing so well, you still have title to those assets and are responsible for them. You can just walk away from them, but you're not likely to do that because they will have salvage value, and so you salvage them. But it's when you get into political enterprises, there is no responsibility for that. There is no ownership for that. And then you get to that, again, which I mentioned earlier, that Pantaleone point, and how then you try to think about a social system, which I think was Pantaleone's great insight. Think about a social system that has these market-based enterprises where the magic number is 2. And then you have these political enterprises where the magic number is 3. And you put them together in the same spot. I think that gets into to then in that model, turn around and give in your mind, your theoretical mind, give to government the job of instilling confidence, removing turbulence, and so forth, is absolutely the impossible thing to do, because the very modus operandi of governmental institutions is to create turbulence where none exists. And so that, again, I think that's a matter of how our theorizing needs to be refreshed a bit. And I think all of us, myself included, am still too much in the grips of outmoded ways of thinking that still harken back to, harken back to keeping a model of perfect competition alive or something, when that's not, I think, a good way to think about what constitutes desirability or goodness in society or not.
All right. Okay, we are about to run out of time, but John Domenica, would you like to ask your question now? This will be the last question.
Oh yeah, it's just a very, very brief observation. Thank you so much, Dick, for this presentation. I was just considered to mention Pareto when I think about this entanglement and this idea of complexity. I always think about the passage in Pareto from pure economics to what he called the sociology and what I call macroeconomics in real terms. So this idea that the magic number cannot be 2 when we talk about macroeconomics. It has been 3 or more. So just a few, this very, very brief observation. Thank you.
Oh, that's absolutely right. You're marvelous on that. And I probably should have been born Italian or something, but Pareto, Davide, Maffeo Pantaleone, many others as well, had a very, I think, Maria over here too, had a very sensible kind of groundedness in the ways of the world. But yeah, that's right. But I guess I've exhausted the time, haven't I?
Oh, yes, I guess if we are to be following our own rules, this is that our time is up. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Dick, and thank you everyone for coming and asking questions, engaging in a discussion. Next month, we will hear from Maria Pia Paganelli on Adam Smith. So quite exciting to have Maria Pia today here, and looking forward to your presentation in just a couple of weeks. So Thank you all, and see you in October. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks,
Enjoyed it.
Marta.
Thank
Thanks,
you for the
Richard.
help.
Great to be here today.
Yeah.